Okay, Jarvis Williams, it has been a while since we've checked in this format, and we've been wanting to record another kind of sense-making conversation for a while. And you've been in this role now as the Director of Race and Democracy at Horizons for a good 6 months. I can't believe we're almost to July, but there's a lot of sense making to do in 6 months worth of
Right.
work. And I guess just to cue up the conversation is just to remind us of the role that Horizons is trying to play in the ecosystem. We have aspirations to be organizing at this ecosystem level. And yet you're also based in Georgia. And one of the priorities we have as a team is how we're in right relationship between national level organizing networks, institutions who have very different entry points to this work. Some of the language that we've been using, we're not the only ones using this framework, but we have our particular spin on it, which is a block, bridge, build framework for how we think of pro-democracy organizing. And then, of course, the race and democracy lens on top of that is just a whole other layer of work and perspective, characters, actors, priorities, lived experience. And it adds a dimension to the work that you're trying to engage in, also being based in Georgia. So that national and state level relationship also comes into play. So lots of layers to this work, which we enjoy. I think we enjoy tussling with all these different layers. So I think the way that we want to cue up the conversation is the tensions that we're leaning into right now and what you've been both observing and how you're grappling with those tensions and how that then is informing what kind of work we're prioritizing.
It's a tense moment all the way around. I don't want to be guilty of prioritizing my tensions as if they are the only tensions. But I think with the kind of lens that the race and democracy work has tried to hone in to and to be attentive to, I think I would probably characterize like three dominant tensions that animate the challenges with organizing at the national state level that dominate the challenge of organizing amongst different groups with different areas of specialization, and that dominate the way different organizations describe who they think they are in the world of organizing, activating citizenship, engagement. And so the way I think about it, I think there's a tension around what is the story that we are participating in and who has told that story that we are a part of. So if you ask the way that looks in real time, if you ask some groups what story they're participating in, they would say they're trying to perfect the democratic institutional process. And they talk about terms, democracy building, democracy renewal, as a way of connecting who they are to the best of what they've been and what they've inherited. But you could also ask people who saw or see themselves as a part of a story of advancing racial justice. And they would say that they are connected to people who are fighting for racial equality, trying to reform, and in some cases, revolutionize ideas so that our institutions have a better concept of what justice would look like. And they describe their work completely different. Their tools are different. Their frameworks are different. And I would name this challenge as the challenge of applied history.
Mhm.
Groups are trying to do work, but they are connected to a history. And what we see in some of the tensions is that we disagree about the history we are participating in.
Yeah.
And we don't really have the space to talk openly about what that history has been, the strengths and the weaknesses. So I think that would be one. Actually, the conference that you and I presented at, Othering and Belonging, one of the major things that people came back after our presentation on the
Yeah.
block bridge build was a appreciation for the tension of history, that
Mhm.
we find ourselves talking about belonging in a history where in the very tradition of using liberty, we had enslavement. and that tension is exists.
One of the areas that Horizons is really committed to is this kind of intermestic learning and sharing.
Absolutely.
And I like the way that you use the word applied history, because it's not just history. It's not
Right.
just, oh, let's learn history in our history books. It's like, how is that informing what you do, what you
Right.
apply? We're all making decisions about our priorities, talking about a story that we tell ourselves. And yet, somehow, our relationship to our history, not just in the United States, but around the world, is being questioned. It's being manipulated. It's being retold over and over again in new ways to fit somebody's either lived experience, political preferences, and or to maintain a status quo of either supremacy, culture. And so this concept of just our relationship to history and how we apply it with regards to what we focus on in our strategy, the frame of then what are we asking of the now? What are we asking for? We're applying that history and we're organizing. And that's why I think it's so interesting, this block bridge build framework. We need to build something,
Absolutely.
not just blocking. We're not just saying what's
Absolutely.
wrong, even though we have to do that too. And we have to bridge across differences, many lines of differences to jointly see ourselves in this future that
Absolutely.
we're building towards. But what is the ask?
Absolutely. Yeah, as we've created the Race and Democracy Brain Trust, and we have people who are helping us think about what communities who are asking the question about what's the right ask for the moment. They are thinking about it. And we have relationships we're cultivating. And I'll just name one specifically. PolicyLink has been instrumental in helping us think about a governing framework. So it's called the Governing for All. They have thought about the kind of ask that will help us to deal with the challenge of poverty across the country. They have asked us to reimagine institutions so that those institutions respond to that million of those of individuals who live in poverty. And it's a way of rethinking what's the point of the institution?
Hmm.
What goals should it set? And I don't want to be too prescriptive because part of doing the work is to be in community with people who are asking that question together and then figuring out how we can best achieve those asks. But I would, coming out of Mississippi, and as I'm based in Georgia, so there are certain asks that happen in Georgia with respect to trying to deal with the incarceration challenge, the ask of trying to make sure public dissent is not compromised with some of the investments being made in some of the city places. There's an ask for equality with healthcare, trying to ensure that institutions in certain rural areas remain funded and we have the integrity. There's an ask for the political integrity of the system. Just recently, some former leaders in Georgia put out Democracy Defense Project. The former mayor Shirley Franklin, Governor Barnes, and a host of other people just trying to respond to the ask for integrity in the election.
Hmm.
And part of what I'm trying to be intentional with our race and democracy work is not just the ask of yesterday, but what is the ask for the future to be as bright as we want it to be? What kind of interpretation of policy prescriptions need to be a part of the public discourse so that the future has a brighter day than the best decisions we've made of our past?
And so then what also then comes into tension, because you're talking about asks of institutions, which then
Yes,
therefore is a leadership challenge. It's an access to decision-making processes. And
yes,
to a certain extent, it's an inside game, right? It's being on
yes,
the inside to be
yes,
able to impact those institutions. And
yes,
so I think one of the tensions that we see then is also then when there's this block formation, that's a pressure campaign. That's a
yes,
different strategy. You're a little bit on the outside in
yes,
order to change incentives, understand power structures and how they need to change within the institutions.
yes,
Of course, that's a part of broader work at Horizons and where race and democracy as a central aspect of all of our work actually then is embedded in the, okay, who are we doing this work with? Are the
right,
partners? What are the relationships? Whose
right,
voices? And where do they situate themselves within these tensions of the inside game and the outside game?
As you can imagine, that's been a very challenging place to be, because what you don't want to do is to reduce people to their ascriptive personality, ethnic, religious sentiments, and say because they are this thing or because their identity represents these ideas, they're ill-equipped to advance the ask we have in mind. And yet you also have to ask the applied history question. So
Mm.
if we think about who has made the kinds of decisions that we are needing to rethink, and we ask if there is a correlation between people who see the world a particular way, who consistently make certain types of decisions, then it's not inappropriate to ask to rethink who those characters who can best
Mhm.
respond to the ask of the moment.
Mhm.
And that's a hard dance.
To put a fine point on it, Jarvis, what you're really talking about is listening. It's both listening and asking, right? Because I think what we're
Absolutely,
saying is we're
absolutely,
listening to folks who
absolutely,
have an experience of applied history, a lens of thinking about what is needed. And
absolutely.
not everybody has the same lens.
I think there needs to be some differentiation among roles,
Yeah.
because there are some people who are skilled who need to be articulating the ideas moving forward, who might not be as skilled dealing with the administration of an institution, who creates the context for that voice to have legitimacy and a place in which it can articulate ideas on a public platform. There are some institutions who are great at the policy level, but not as great at the grassroots level.
Mhm.
And trying to be respectful for what people's and organizational skills are. And yet we also have to ask the question, and here's where I think our work gives us some anchoring. What is the applied history tied to the ask that we're trying to put forth? And as we settle those two tensions, it becomes a lot easier to see who needs to be in what role, and who or what needs to be the leader, how, and what justificatory arguments could we make as to why that voice, that leader, that institution is in the front of trying to advance a thing.
And
Um,
when you say the thing, you're talking about being at the head of dealing with over incarceration, dealing with housing issues, educational
right,
injustice, all of
right,
the very practical ways
right,
the democracy agenda is
right.
impacting people unequally, essentially.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know what? One of the things that I think, and this is an addition, that was so interesting that kind of helps us to think about what happens when you have the right ask, but not the right personnel. The challenge with integration, I think, really was a historically interesting picture because we had the right idea. We need
Mm.
to integrate society. But then at the local levels, who was in place to exercise their agency to make it successful? And then the cast of actors that you need to ensure a policy success becomes critical to whether or not that policy can be successful. And if you don't have the actors at the institutional level, even though you have the policy idea at the Supreme Court level, legal level, then we see a fissuring of what it means in practice. And I think that same challenge became more pronounced when President Biden gave us the Advancing Racial Justice Memorandum. And I specifically asked the question, it's a great memorandum, but who is in position to make the decisions? What skills do they need? What history are they going to apply to do this?
Mm.
And I think that's the work of our generation, to try to figure out how to support the right actors to be able to make sure that the ask can be materialized.
Essentially, this is a reform question, right? We've got reforms, we've got policy agendas. Who are we doing that with? And who are we accountable to? You say that a lot, right?
Yeah, if the applied history suggests that we've tried to rebuild America without asking certain communities to participate, it then stands to reason that the way we rebuild must mean we specifically know what those communities who we haven't asked are actually doing and saying and thinking as we create the new ask for the future. And I think it's at that agenda setting level that our race and democracy work is very intentional, because we're trying to make sure we are making asks connected to those whose voice and dignity, according to the applied history, has not been a part of the conversation.
Not to go off course too much, but because you and I are talking at the end of June, when there's something going on in Kenya right now that I just feel the need to bring into this conversation, because I actually think it really has a lot to do with what we're talking about. There is a finance bill that is being proposed. It has a lot of implications for the inequalities in the country. And there's just been this explosion of youth activism and just really intense organizing on the streets. And there's been a couple of things that have happened. Really intense police crackdown,
Mm,
which has been just horrific to watch from afar.
mm,
And the president conceded, and the bill isn't
mm.
going forward. So there was a win. And there's a coalition that came together. And I know that they're asking these same questions now. Who is in place? What is the ask now? What
Right.
comes next? It's much bigger than the specific bill, all these economic issues that brought people forward. It's going to be super interesting to see what happens. And I'm actually just wanting to reinforce your point, Jarvis. I want to
Mm,
reinforce that what you're saying is there is a role for this block formation and to take advantage of the energy and the anger and the sentiment for demanding change,
right.
and then being ready within
Right.
institutions to
Right.
actually do the change. Our work, if you're combating authoritarianism, if you're pro-democracy, it's beyond any one election. What happens after the election? Who's in
Right.
place to actually put together the policies if you are putting pressure? That analysis of the race and democracy portfolio, we sometimes think about just one aspect of block bridge build. But you're also reminding us that we need to be ready with both the applied history, the right people in the right places, the partnerships, but then the ask to follow
Absolutely.
through.
And I think the OBI learning cohort that we were part of doing this cross transatlantic learning, the vision behind it, I think other people are catching on that we
Mm,
also need new civic leaders. We need civic leaders who have an international sensibility, who are thinking in relationship to people in different political contexts, and what kind of civic infrastructure internationally is useful to combat the massive challenges of climate, the massive challenges
mm,
of demographic shifts, the massive challenges of repressive tactics to quiet voices because the political systems we have don't operate the way we intended when demographics change. And if we know we need these new leaders and these new voices, then of course, I think Horizons, and part of why I love our work, but it's so challenging, is the investment in the learning, the investment in strategy, the investment in international affairs, the investment in history. And we're constantly reading and thinking and reading and talking because we don't know what the new world demands of us completely. And
mm.
I think being humble to know that, and yet being willing to put your best foot forward in partnership with great people, is really the relational infrastructure needed for our moment. And I think you couldn't be more right. It's a serious analytical precision to strategizing what you're doing, why you're doing it, who's going to do it, to what end. But there is a relational aspect too of people who, if I say, Julia, we're going north, I don't know what we'll find. I just know if we walk together, we will be capable of responding to whatever happens on that journey.
My friend, I'm glad to be on this journey with you. Let's continue walking down the path and don't have all the answers, but definitely continuing to ask the questions.
Absolutely.
continue to learn. So thanks as always, Jarvis. It's a good conversation.
Look forward to the next one.